also actually coordinate the first-year seminar program, so some of you know about that. And I'm here to talk to you about trends in teen fiction. I hope that's not too much of a misnomer. I'm going to talk mostly about children's and teen fantasy literature, actually, because that's the area that I know the most about and that I'm the most interested in, and that also has been, I'd say, in the past 15 years or so, maybe, really the sort of growth area in children's and young adult literature. So that's what I'm going to talk about, and I think towards the end we're actually going to give away these lovely guys standing here. So wait for that. All right, so I'm going to get started. You may not know it, but we're living in a golden age of children's fantasy literature. In the last 15 years, the kind and quality of offerings available for children has grown and developed to rival any single period in past literary history, I believe. From Philip Pullman to J.K. Rowling, Stephanie Meyer to Suzanne Collins, fantastical books for children and young adults are on the bestseller lists, discussed in college classrooms, and most importantly, really, keeping kids up late at night with flashlights under the covers, or not. It's a great time to be reading books for kids, and lots of adults are doing it as well. Not everyone thinks this is great news. Keepers of the literary flame, writers and critics like A.S. Byatt and Harold Bloom have made public statements about the debasement of adult literary taste, suggesting that an affinity for books like the Harry Potter series is infantile, middle, or even lowbrow, and perhaps even dangerous. It certainly, Bloom suggests, won't turn its readers into more cultured or sophisticated people. I think he might be wrong there. Bloom's famous diatribe against the Harry Potter series, which appeared in the Wall Street Journal in July 2000, predicts confidently that the cultural critics will soon enough introduce Harry Potter into their college curriculum, and the New York Times will go on celebrating another confirmation of the dumbing down it leads and exemplifies. Actually, by 2000, they already had. I gave a final exam 3 months before Professor Bloom's article appeared, in which, among other things, I asked students to identify the novel that begins with the sentence, Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. I believe everyone got that question right, by the way. Now, I teach children's literature, and it's my job to keep up with what children are reading. It's a great job. I can't say I like it all. I've never really developed a taste for Captain Underpants, for example, although actually a colleague of mine wrote a fantastic article about it. It made me think I've really got to read these books, but I haven't gotten to them yet. And I didn't really jump on the Percy Jackson bandwagon either, though I did enjoy the first novel in the series. Still, unlike Professor Bloom, I not only have a professional obligation to keep up with what's going on in children's literature, I like it and I think it's good. I turned to children's literature as an academic specialty just about the time that the Harry Potter books hit our shores. In 1999 to 2000, I was about to go on my first sabbatical, and I spent it retraining myself. I'd begun my career here as a scholar of Victorian literature. George Eliot, Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell, the Brontes, and others. I loved those novelists, and I'd written scholarly articles about them, taught them with, I thought, pretty reasonable success. But after over 10 years of college teaching, I needed a break. Without entirely realizing what I was doing, I spent much of my sabbatical reading children's and young adult literature. I just taught my first children's literature class a year or two earlier. And I felt pretty keenly, actually, the gaps in my education. While I taught a good class, I did a lot of homework on my way to teaching it for the first time. Still, I taught mostly books that I had read as a child and a few that I'd encountered through my own children. I knew there had to be more out there. That year that I spent re-educating myself, I discovered Philip Pullman and J.K. Rowling. Soon after, I also read Terry Pratchett and Diana Wynne Jones, among others. These are some of Britain's top fantasy writers for children. I rediscovered old classics, but I also discovered that much of the best, most popular, and most interesting material was quite new. Philip Pullman began the His Dark Materials trilogy in 1995 with The Golden Compass, known as Northern Lights in England. J.K. Rowling published the first Harry Potter book in 1997, though it didn't reach this country until 1998. Both, though, were actually still relatively new and unknown when I first checked them out in the library in 1999. interested, and what keeps both adults and children interested now. And perhaps most importantly, what is it about our own cultural moment that makes this literature so popular, and I think even so relevant? Unlike Harold Bloom, I don't think it's because we've suddenly become stupid or childish or lazy, though certainly there are those who would argue that those things are true. And sure, I mean, I wonder too if Google's making me stupid, but I got interested in Harry Potter long before Google came on the scene. So a little historical perspective might help us here. Children's literature, at least children's literature as we know it, is a relatively young literary genre. While of course people have always told stories to their children, and while fairy tales, folk tales, parables, and fables have been around for centuries, if not millennia, literature written and produced specifically for children doesn't really turn up until the 18th century or thereabouts, roughly coinciding with the development of the Romantic movement in English literary history. Medieval and early modern children didn't really, as far as we know, live their lives very segregated from adults. They worked with them, ate with them, slept with them, and listened to the same stories. But, and we can trace this development variously to the Romantic conception of the child, change in labor practices brought about by early industrialization, rising child survival rates, and a number of other factors. In the 1700s, we start to see books and magazines written explicitly for the entertainment of children. Some historians even put a very specific date on things. In 1744, John Newbery, for whom the Newbery Award for Excellence in Children's Literature was much later named, published A Little Pretty Pocketbook, a book, by the way, that came packaged with a toy. There is nothing new under the merchandising sign. While there are books for children that date back earlier, Newbery certainly pushed children's publishing into the forefront. His books were small, cheap, illustrated, came with toys, and while they were certainly intended to teach, they also entertained. So, children's literature is only about 250 years old, give or take, far younger than tragedy, epic, novel. And in that time, it's had several golden ages. The first was probably in the Victorian period, about 100 years after Newbery, when children's publishing was a booming business. While many of the earliest children's books, such as The Little Pretty Pocketbook, are of interest today only to historians and literary scholars, some of the great Victorian children's books are still very much in print. Books like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, Black Beauty, Peter Pan, Edward Lear's Book of Nonsense. It took almost 100 years then for the industry to produce anything really lasting, but then it took off. Some of the earliest popular books for children were, like Lewis Carroll's Alice books, books of fantasy. I think there's several reasons for this. The 19th century is often represented to us as a painfully earnest and boring time. I blame Oscar Wilde for this. And even if that's an exaggeration, it's certainly true to say that it was a time of great expansion of industry, work, and wealth. The modern factory job was invented in the 19th century, as was the modern office job. And while the great accomplishments in literature for adults in the period are found in the realistic novels of writers like Dickens and Eliot, the flip side of realism, fantasy, is never far away. We can call it escapism or we can call it balance, but we find it in Dickens' Christmas Carol with its hauntings and ghosts, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, and in works for children like the Alice books and their less well-known cousin, Charles Kingsley's The Water Babies, which is a really bizarrely interesting environmental Christian fantasy of evolution. Anyway, and remarkably still quite readable. I think we're going through another golden age of children's literature right now, and just as in the Victorian period, I think it has many origins. One may be simply generational. When the Harry Potter books first started appearing, it had been 30 to 40 years since the last heyday of fantasy for children. I'm not really talking about that middle period. The period from, say, the publication of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings series, which was completed in 1949, but really most popular in the 1960s, as were C.S. Lewis's Narnia books. So from that period to the early 60s appearance of Madeline Langell's A Wrinkle in Time, which was followed by 3 other books over the next sort of 25 years. So that middle period, it had been almost 30 years really since we'd seen another big push. And literary genres have their cycles, just like other fashions. And then, first the Harry Potter books, and then the Twilight books, did come with a great deal of hype and with great marketing buzz. J.K. Rowling was a single mother and first-time author who had been probably catapulted to immense fame and fortune, while Stephanie Meyer was a Mormon mother of 3, also a first-time author when her books, which she claimed came to her in a dream, began appearing. I mean, that's marketing gold. You can sell them. They sell themselves. Well, that's not quite enough. The first Harry Potter books actually spread far more by word of mouth and marketing, and there weren't these timed release dates and the midnight parties or any of that. I first heard about them from other children's lit folks, and first put Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone on my syllabus in the spring of 2000. There were starting to be waiting lists in libraries at that point, so 3 years after it first came out. But still no really big hype until the movies started appearing in 2001. Similarly, the Twilight books surprised everyone with their popularity, including me. I had no particular interest in them until repeatedly the daughters of my friends insisted that I read them. They weren't following the hype, except perhaps the word of mouth hype in their schools. They were genuinely in love with these huge doorstop books. It was a remarkable thing. Certain other books have hit the bestseller list and been widely unread. I remember folks claiming that more people bought Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose than actually read it, for example, and much later the same, I think, was true of the Da Vinci Code, actually. Everyone bought it, not everyone read it. But the girls who were buying the Twilight books were reading them and passing them on and reading them again, and so apparently were their mothers. I think a real cause of the books, and then really the whole genre's popularity, was a kind of hunger for narrative and a hunger for fantasy, a hunger for a different kind of storytelling. Bruno Bettelheim, in his book The Uses of Enchantment, published in 1976, talks about having trouble finding really great imaginative literature for children at that time in the mid-70s, and he turned to fairy tales as a result. Now, he might not have looked hard enough. Madeleine L'Engle, Ursula Le Guin, and Lloyd Alexander in this country, Diana Wynne Jones and Susan Cooper in England were producing high-quality fantasy for children in the 70s. But it's also true that much of fantasy literature had gone underground and then ultimately, in the 90s, online, into endless games of Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games. And those feed almost exactly the same hunger, really, for fantastic narrative. That hunger may also have developed or derived from a certain tendency towards escapism in difficult times. And I know we've spent a lot of time culturally of late being a little bit nostalgic for the boom years of the 90s, but actually the late 90s were a pretty anxious time. And then after 2001, of course, it seemed we might need to look for comfort or escape wherever we could find it. But there's an interesting thing about escapism. It has a tendency, when we seek out escapes, they bring us back to the thing that we think we're escaping from. Now I'm going to give you an example of what I mean that takes us a little bit away from Twilight and Harry Potter for a minute, but trust me, we'll get back there. On September 12th, 2001, I taught a Victorian literature class, or I was scheduled to do so. I met my class, still stunned, still in shock, for what was to be our final day of discussion of Jane Eyre. It's one of my favorite novels. It reveals something new to me every time I teach it. That morning, I sat on a desk in front of my class and told them I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to teach them in the face of such horror and destruction. I asked what they wanted to do. And they talked a little about not knowing what to do or how to do it. Many of them had friends and families in New York, New Jersey, DC. One was on the road to her family in New York. The whole campus, we'd all been told not to go anywhere, but she couldn't stay away. It didn't seem like a time for obedience to the rules, the cautions, or especially the syllabus. But there we were with a book in front of us, and I knew that later in the semester, if there was a later in the semester, which in the moment really seemed far from certain, but later in the semester we would want to have talked about it. So pretty uncertainly, actually, I started to read aloud to them favorite passages from the book, and I always go to reading aloud for comfort. Jane Eyre, the classic novel of adolescent angst and mature longings, is a novel well aware of evil and cruelty, but still determined to seek beauty and truth. I find myself drawn even now to the scene in which Jane finally confronts her master. Do you think I am an automaton? A machine without feelings? Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain, and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and full as much heart. I love that passage for its clarity and its anger, and also for its implicit recognition that we all have soul and heart. There are flawed human beings in Jane Eyre, but they are all worthy of at least that acknowledgement. Later that day, I actually wrote an email to my students putting in words what I had tried more haltingly to say that morning. I wrote, I don't know about the rest of you, but the events of the last few days have left me not only stunned and angry, but grateful in a small way for what we do. In the face of human tragedy and evil, it helps me at least to know that we spend our days with works of great beauty and truth, and to think that creative artists have faced tragedy and evil themselves and continue to face them, and that the ways they face them give us something to think about in the present moment. So Jane Eyre was one of my early choices, serendipitously really, for comfort reading in those difficult days, but not the only one. And Harry Potter began to fill that void for me, and I think really for lots of people. From Jane Eyre to Harry Potter and on to Twilight is not as big a stretch as it might seem. A lot of people see Jane Eyre as one of the first young adult novels, actually. Jane is 10 when it begins, 18 when she's first engaged to Rochester, barely in her 20s as the novel ends. It's a classic story of adolescent development. A coming-of-age novel in the classic sense. It anticipates Catcher in the Rye, and even Harry Potter, which learns from it something of the loneliness of the orphan, the way boarding school can become a surrogate family, the way being able to do something, teach, fly, do magic, paint, is the key to growing up. One of the great draws of the first few Harry Potter novels, especially it seems to me, is their melding of fantasy with Jane Eyre-style domestic realism. In many ways, Rowling owes more to Dickens and Austen than C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. Indeed, she claimed not to have been a big fantasy reader before her own great success in the genre. When she's asked what her literary forebears are, this is where she goes. But what the Harry Potter books offered that Jane Eyre and Catcher in the Rye don't, and that I think had a particular appeal in that historical moment, was that sense of doing battle with ultimate evil. Jane has to fight for recognition in a class-based hierarchy, Holden, Caulfield from Catcher in the Rye, for authenticity in a world full of phonies. And those are both important fights, worth continuing. Harry fights those fights too, but they are subsumed into his good over evil battle with the Dark Lord, who haunts every episode of the series. This gave the series its appeal for many youngsters, of course, who dream of heroic battles and epic confrontations. But it seemed at times that it might also be a little bit of a danger. In a post-9/11 world, how many of us think in these starkly polarized terms, hoping to rid the world of evil with one epic battle? One of the things I particularly liked about the last books in the series, then, is the way they seem to refuse the stark polarization of good and evil that characterized the earlier episodes. While some readers obviously hoped Harry would kill Voldemort and the battle would be over, just as so many of us hope for similar outcomes in similar conflicts, I was pleased that he learned it's not quite that simple. The final volume, it seems to me, demonstrated that Harry, along with Jane and Pullman and the rest of us, had to learn that it's hard to know who's good and who's evil, who's right and who's wrong. Vanquishing one evil may spawn others, after all, which is not a recommendation for passivity, but for deliberation, for consideration, for complexity, all things that we get from reading. These are hard to achieve in literature and life, but they're among the qualities that distinguish our best books, ideas, art, from the merely popular. We saw the seeds of such complexity in the later Potter books in characters like Draco Malfoy and Severus Snape, as well as Harry himself, characters who didn't always act as we expected or do what they're supposed to do, characters who are complicated. Escapism, pure, simple escapism, may be more to the point of the popularity of the Twilight books, which I'll add have their own tangential connection to the Brontes, as I'll discuss in a moment. But they too have their moments of confrontation between good and evil, the bad vampires versus the good ones. Sorry if this is a spoiler for anyone. A confrontation which ends without the expected bloodletting or battle royale. Still, I think most of the series' young readers were hooked long before they knew such a confrontation was coming. Unlike the Harry Potter books, the Twilight series hooked readers with romance rather than adventure. And as romantic fantasy, the series offered some very real consolations. Vampire stories are, of course, perfect for teenagers. Vampires stay out all night, scare the respectable citizens, take scary risks, and live seemingly forever. And they're sexy and dangerous. Well, mostly. While vampire sexuality may not have been an overt part of vampire literature before, say, Anne Rice, An Interview with a Vampire, even in Bram Stoker's original novel, Dracula, from 1897, the image of the attractive man feasting on the bared neck of a woman had clear sexual implications. Male vampires traditionally feast on women, females on men. Their feasting is intimate and transformative the first time it matters. Vampire stories come and go, but they've been particularly popular among teenagers, it seems to me, during the age of AIDS. They titillate with their suggestion of a sweet fatality born in the blood. Even in an earlier time, though, I have to confess I had my own vampire summer. My first summer after college, I saw the Frank Langella Dracula at least 4 times. Swooning every time, actually 4 times in a row. Swooning over his sophistication, his sadness, and his silk tuxedo. Around that same time, Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles were becoming popular, and in the 90s, the TV series Buffy the Vampire Slayer had a fairly sustained popularity for a while. But not one of these reached anything like the levels we saw with the Twilight books. And again, I think it may in part because Meyer, like Rowling, was able to infuse new life into an old genre, where Rowling took sort of domestic realism and infused it with fantasy. Meyer brought vampires into the romance novel. Again, other people may have done so earlier, but Meyer really struck a chord with her version. One thing that I think both series share is they're really pretty intensely nostalgic. Forks, Washington, where Bella Swan lives, seems to exist in a time just before cell phones and widespread internet access have completely taken over. They actually do use cell phones in the last couple books, but in the first couple, her internet connection is really slow. She doesn't have a phone. It's really like a little while ago. And the wizards of the Harry Potter series are mystified by subway turnstiles and the internal combustion engine, let alone the internet. Both series also seem remarkably free of a certain kind of sexual freedom that characterizes a lot of other teen books. Bella and Edward rather famously wait for marriage, while Harry, though in love with Ginny for at least 3 volumes, barely manages to kiss her before the epilogue. Both series are actually far more violent than they are sexual, perhaps reflecting a streak that's been increasingly apparent in film and television ratings as well. And both also depict a fairy tale type of romance that promises both love at almost first sight and happily ever after for teen protagonists who haven't even graduated from high school yet. There's a kind of comfort in this sort of reading, a predictability that's leavened by the completely unpredictable adventures, and especially in Rowling's case, I think, the sharp characterization of the characters. We don't know, that is, what all the obstacles will be that conspire to keep Harry and Ginny, or Bella and Edward apart, but we can, I think, pretty confidently and without spoiling anything, predict that there will be obstacles and that they will eventually be surmounted. So that's why I think these books are popular. Great marketing, a hunger for fantasy, a canny mixing of genres, and a nostalgia for comfort and predictability. If those are the causes, what are the consequences? My original sort of blurb for this talked about causes and consequences, but this part's a lot shorter. I think there's several, and most of them quite positive. First, and this is dear to my heart, we're taking children's and young adult literature seriously. While there have been college courses and, believe it or not, academic conferences, papers, books on children's and young adult literature for well over a generation, their profile has been heightened by the recent mainstream attention to the genre. When the New York Times names a bestseller list for your genre, as they did with children's literature in 2000, in direct response to the Harry Potter phenomenon, people pay attention. This is a good thing overall. I believe it increases not only the visibility, but the quality of children's literature to have people paying attention to it, writing about it, and promoting it thoughtfully. Second, children are reading. You may not remember, but I know I do, the predictions that children would not read big books, fat books, long books. And these 2 series among others, have certainly proved that wrong. Not only that, but it's also possible that these books serve as a kind of gateway drug into more complex and sophisticated reading. For every student I meet who loved the Harry Potter books and still reads them every summer, and I did talk to one in my office just last week, I meet another who loved the Harry Potter books, then discovered Philip Pullman, then went on to Milton. Or if not Milton, because that's maybe occasional, but they do. But I certainly see students who go from Twilight to Jane Eyre. You may actually have seen the Twilight-themed cover for Wuthering Heights that was on display in some bookstores last summer. It actually said on the cover, "Read Bella and Edward's favorite book." This is something actually of a misreading of Twilight. Bella likes Wuthering Heights well enough, but Edward dismisses it, perhaps recognizing a little too much Heathcliff in himself. Still, I have truly met middle school girls who moved from the Twilight series to the Brontes and Austen and Shakespeare, all of whom are referenced in the novels. And these girls were able to talk about why. These books served as a real gateway for them into a lot more complicated and interesting reading. Not that this wasn't interesting. A third consequence, again of particular pleasure to folks like me who read and study children's literature, is that the popularity of fantasy series like Harry Potter have brought new attention to some other fantasy series. I've already mentioned Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials trilogy, but it's also clear that the Harry Potter phenomenon brought some terrific books by Diana Wynne Jones, an English fantasy writer who began publishing in the 80s back into print. If you don't know her work, try the Crestomancy series with a fantasy-loving kid you know, or Howl's Moving Castle, both the novel and the more recent animated movie. Terry Pratchett, long well known in England for his Discworld fantasies, found out recently he's the most shoplifted author in England. He kept statistics. Pratchett has also gained new prominence in the wake of Rowling, and his Tiffany Aching books for kids are terrific, funny, thought-provoking fantasies. And there's another due out in about 10 days. But it's probably the new fantasy writers who got the most benefit. Suzanne Collins, author of the Hunger Games trilogy, may not want to be compared to Stephanie Meyer, but because her books are popular with many of the same young readers, she will be. And if that brings this smart, scary, dystopian fantasy to more readers, so much the better. It's really a terrific series. Recently, some scientists have even begun speculating that there are specific measurable effects on readers' brains from reading these novels. Reporting on this research, literary critic Maria Nikolayeva has said that the adolescent brain goes through a significant and rapid change. Everything that affects it leaves deep imprints. Very dark fiction creates and amplifies a sense of insecurity, which is typical of adolescence. But it can also be a liberation when readers share their personal experience with that of fictional characters. So yes, all readers' brains are changed after they have read a book, but teenage brains are especially perceptive and therefore vulnerable. Nikolayeva suggests then that these books do serve a need in adolescence, perhaps in a way for a safe experimentation and vicarious experimentation with passionate romance or with the dramatic poles of good and evil. For adults, the pleasures are both similar and different, I think. While we may no longer require the education that vicarious experience through books can provide us, adults as much as children do, I believe, hunger for a good story. The story of Twilight is in many ways, like many contemporary romance novels, the story of Jane Eyre, in which a young woman with a clear sense of her own identity falls somewhat surprisingly in love with a much older, somewhat forbidding, possibly dangerous man named Edward. Now, I happen to think Jane Eyre is a more complex and interesting version of that story than Twilight, but the appeal of the romance is quite similar. Harry Potter, on the other hand, is that sturdiest of all conventional stories, a Cinderella story, in which an abused and abased orphan discovers, magically, a whole new world of experience. The His Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman, which I mentioned earlier, is an explicit rewriting of Paradise Lost with, I might add, far better gender politics. Again, what many contemporary fantasies do so well, and that I think really appeals to both adult and child readers, but maybe even especially to adult readers who are familiar with the other stories, They offer a blending of stories, the incorporation of familiar stories with new twists, familiar plot lines with fabulous new settings, refreshing us as they continue to serve our hunger for narrative. So, maybe we don't need another Education of a Wizard story or another vampire story. But then again, these are sturdy genres. For Education of a Wizard, I can think back to Ursula Le Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea, Diana Wynne Jones' Witch Week, or Diane Duane's So You Want to Be a Wizard, a series that started, I believe, in the 80s or early 90s, kind of went fallow for a while, and she's just started publishing new books in it. I think there are about 7 now in this Young Wizard series, and they're quite good, and still in print. For vampires, we can go back to Dracula or forward to True Blood. The Twilight saga just offers one more twist on that old topic. But the explorations that these novels and others like them offer can indeed make us better readers, better thinkers, and I think really more mature adults. And I have a list, I can put it on the screen, I also have it as a handout. I have a list of other, because we said trends in teen fiction, and I really talked only about one very specific trend, but I actually have a somewhat idiosyncratic, as this says, list of other fantasy series that might be of interest. If you'd like a printed copy of that, I have it to hand out because it's actually 3 slides long. So I'll just let you know that that's there. I'm happy to talk further about any of these issues, take your questions, and then we do have a couple of door prizes to give away too.
Yes. When you were talking about the series and you talked a lot about the romance and the Stephanie Meyer and young ladies, is there more things for young gentlemen, or do they cross gender?
I would say actually the books on the list that I have here are really, I tried really hard to find books that are kind of equally appealing to boys and girls. I have a 13-year-old son and a 21-year-old daughter, and my son looked at the list that I have. I actually checked it out with him, and he said, there might be boys who read Twilight, but they're not going to admit it in middle school. But these books, and he won't, and somewhat to my chagrin, because he might actually enjoy them, but he's 13. Right? You police the gender boundaries very, very carefully at 13. So a lot of the fantasy books, I think, actually are really equally appealing. One thing about His Dark Materials trilogy, for example, is there's a heroine, the protagonist is female, but the adventures are so compelling that I have never met a male fantasy reader who didn't get immediately sucked in. And she picks up a lot of male companions along the way, and they're almost equally as important later on. So I'd say there are lots.
How has Harry Potter done in non-English speaking cultures? Is it a big hit in China or other places? Or
Actually pirated versions of Harry Potter are all over China. Yeah, it's been translated, I think, into more languages than almost any other book except perhaps the Bible. In fact, I don't know if you saw, but one of the slides that I went through kind of quickly, but it was a boy reading it in German. And it's been translated into lots of non-Western languages. It's very popular all over the world. Interesting, a lot of fantasy is. Interestingly, Alice in Wonderland, which to me really relies on English wordplay, is also translated into lots of other languages. So there's something, fantasy for children. It's also true that the English-speaking world is a net exporter of children's books generally. That is, almost everyone in the world reads English and American children's books, whereas we read far fewer translated books from other countries. And that's true in popular culture generally, but even more so in children's literature. Yes?
For literary purists, do you think it's significant that these 2 examples can move into visual media a lot faster than they could have ever moved into, say, the 19th century?
Well, actually in the 19th century, popular novels moved into visual media really quickly. We just don't still have it. Dickens' novels were pirated into stage versions, often before they were even finished publishing, because they were published serially. The history of the Victorian stage is one that, I'm not going to write, somebody should, but it's really hard to write because that stuff is really ephemeral. And obviously they weren't films, and nobody, and even early film has not been really preserved. But those stage adaptations, George Eliot's books, which strike me as so internal and so impossible to adapt, there were stage versions of them. So I think what happened is not so much that those books weren't sort of susceptible to visual adaptation, but that there wasn't the kind of ubiquity of visual imagery that there is now. I mean, if you didn't go to the play, you didn't see the play. But, I know tons and tons of people who have never read a Twilight novel, never seen a Twilight movie, who know exactly who these characters are. Right, so we live in a time when there's just more of it, so it's more available. But we have always been actually a visual. Humans like to turn their stories into visual adaptations. We do it all the time. Yeah.
Do you think that there's something sort of important in the continuation of this convention of serializing that was popular in Victorian literature for adults as well, like whatever, for children. But it seems that a lot of popular children's literature is serialized. Do you think that has something to do with perhaps this idea of growth, of going back, growing here?
That's a really good question. When I teach my children's literature course to undergraduates, I have a final project where students write a paper on a book of their own choosing, and I tell them no series fiction, but I mean a certain kind of series fiction, because there are really two kinds, right? There's series fiction like, actually Captain Underpants I think works this way, or Nancy Drew, or the Hardy Boys, or to put it in the comics realm, Peanuts, where the characters don't age, and every episode is just an episode, but you have no concept of growth or development over time. Whereas the books you're talking about, the books that I'm talking about here, those series in which the characters do grow and change, they really do sort of hark back to the Victorian serialized novel. And novels, especially like the ones we're talking about here, the His Dark Materials trilogy, the Harry Potter series, the Twilight series, those authors think of them as single works, right? That they knew where they were going. They knew, famously, J.K. Rowling sitting on the train, knew the end of the Harry Potter series before she began it. And so I do think that those are particularly appealing to child readers who get to grow up with the characters. And the kids, it's actually kind of your generation who tracked Harry's development, right, who were pretty much the same age as Harry, I think had a really special and kind of unique relationship with those books. And I'll be interested to see, what it's like for children, born now, from the whole series has always existed. You read it kind of differently. And the other thing, I see this in popular culture too, right? Series drama and reality TV have brought the continuing narrative back to us in a way that, the sitcoms, for example, that I grew up on were much more like Peanuts, right? It was just an episode, but, people didn't really change. Like Mary Tyler Moore didn't really change over time, right? She was just always Mary Tyler Moore. So I think you're right. There is something that is particularly appealing to children, but it seems that all of us actually really like and want to have access to in one way or another. And as the daytime soaps have kind of gone sort of downhill in their appeal, other things that have that same kind of narrative structure are coming to take their place.
Do you think the times are such that teen fantasy will have to do with technology, and the days are gone that other genres such as, I guess this would pertain more to preteen, but genres that have to do with animals and fantasy belonging with pets and that sort of thing? I'm thinking, when I was a boy, there were, I forget the author, but there was a book about the animals in the English countryside.
Yeah.
The
The Wind in the Willows.
The Wind in the Willows
Yeah.
kind of thing, and the other ones, there was something called Rabbit, Yellow
Right.
Eyes of Rabbit. Maybe even in the 40s, there was the Eagle in the South with the deers.
Right. Animal fantasy is still really popular, actually. It's not on my list because I read one and I had had enough, but one of the really popular series for kids right now is called The Warriors, and there are like, I think 3 different iterations now of Warriors books that are about feral cats. And as somebody who actually has a pet cat and thinks, there's a problem with allowing cats to be feral, I had a little trouble with the whole premise for the fantasy, but once you get beyond that, they have like tribes and they have battles and they have territories, and my son, can consume those pretty endlessly, and there are lots of others as well. Yeah.
When you were talking about the lack of cell phones in Harry Potter and the dial-up internet that Bella has to use in the beginning of the Twilight series, how would you then respond to, what do you think the function of not including all of our technological updates, like in something like the Artemis Fowl series, where it's so reliant on the novelty of certain technologies? Where do you think that would leave the Harry Potter series? In that, do you think that makes them more timeless, or is there something missing from these books that they don't include the fact that our technology evolves constantly?
Well, we can still read Bleak House, right? And nobody drives a car in Bleak House. So, at some level, the less technology and the less sort of up-to-the-minute stuff you have in your book, the less it dates. The Gossip Girls books are going to date way faster, I think, than the Harry Potter books. For a variety of reasons, but one is because they're name-dropping labels all the time, and those labels are going to lose, their cultural currency. Just imagine, in 50 years, people are going to have to read footnoted versions of the Gossip Girls in order to understand them, or just, stop reading them. And that happened. That happened to. There's a whole school of Victorian novels called Silver Fork novels that were all about sort of polite society, and they're nearly unreadable now because the cultural codes that they rely on are so specific to that time. And so really only literary scholars read them, and they, dig up exactly what, that color of dress meant that season. So in a way, I think not including it actually allows the books to continue. But the other thing is that, the interesting thing about fantasy is a lot of the things that people can do in fantasy then become real. I heard a story in NPR maybe it was a couple of weeks ago, but how many things first imagined by science fiction writers have actually now become actual technology. And the interesting thing is that when they were imagined by science fiction writers, it was kind of in a dystopic way. Like they thought, ooh, this would be really dangerous if this could happen. And yet those have been invented. So sometimes fantasy and science fiction have a kind of predictive quality to them, although never exactly what you want, right? How many of you are still waiting for your jetpack from the Jetsons? Right? But they did apparently, imagine Skype, right? And now we have it. So. Yeah, I think there's a real mix too. Some of the books that I put on this list, the Alchemist series, for example, by Michael Scott, which I think is a terrific fantasy series and draws on a really interesting kind of multicultural mix of mythology and folklore and legend, takes place in an absolutely contemporary setting as well, with fast cars and satellite phones and Wi-Fi and stuff like that. And periodically they get kind of thrown into a pocket of the past or a dead zone, and they're and they can't Google anything anymore, and they have to actually read a book to find out who this legendary figure is or something. So that author sort of plays with it in kind of nice ways. Yeah.
I think in relation to that, how do you feel about the updating of books with new technology? I know, for example, they're rewriting the Sweet Valley High books with cell phones and Skype and all of the modern labels, and I have mixed feelings about that.
I guess I can't say I'm so invested in the high literary quality of the Sweet Valley High books that it doesn't trouble me. What I do see happens actually more frequently and kind of interestingly is a sort of boundarizing, that is updating political ideas or notions or cultural ideas or notions that have become distasteful. So that, for example, the book Dr. Dolittle has been rewritten, and none of you have encountered the original, actually, in which there's an African prince who wants, in the original version, desperately to be white. And that entire episode has been rewritten. He wants to be a lion or something instead. And similarly, Mary Poppins had some extraordinarily racist episodes in it. And some of those P.L. Travers herself rewrote, and others have been rewritten by other writers since then. And I have really mixed feelings about those. On the one hand, I think, great, it makes it more accessible to more readers now. And, I would hope that writer, in a way, wouldn't mind. On the other hand, I think it's important to preserve the originals, to say, there were problems with these things, and these things were acceptable, and we need to talk about why that was acceptable in literature for children. But updating the technology, I know they've done it with some Judy Blume novels, too, having to do with, drugstore products and stuff, and it's interesting to see that. I don't mind that as much. That seems fairly benign.